Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Great to see you back here for day 3. It's been fantastic to see everybody's participation over the last 2 days, and people have been saying, okay, well, final day. Well, actually, it keeps on ramping up today. It's a bit like a cliff at the end. We get you all excited, and you want to stay for day 4, and then we say, we're going to have to engage later in the year and into next year as our journey as a centre continues. So we'll leave you excited for the future and excited to continue to engage with the Natural Hazard Research Australia program. So that's fantastic. And as I said right from the very start, it's your participation in this forum, your engagement in this forum, which actually makes it. It's not necessarily the work and the effort of NHRA, it's everybody in this room that is so vitally important to the success of these forums. I want to start off this morning also saying what a great welcome to country Daniel Ross provided us with today, and again we can reflect on that welcome throughout the rest of the day. Hey, we've got a really big program today, so we're going to be launching our post-flood social research work in a moment, which really reflects an incredible amount of effort from the research team, but the work really showing that clear connection with the end-user driven approach, which is so important to our work, but also the connections with those end-user organisations and how we're already seeing the initial impact from that work, even though it's just been completed and finalised in the last few weeks. Just a few housekeeping matters as well before moving along into the program. So again, we're really fortunate enough to also have all the people online today, so g'day to everybody online. We've got a few extra people for this morning's session because we've opened up to a number of the local councils which have been impacted by the floods as well. So we've got local governments in New South Wales and Queensland joining us online, so welcome to all of you online. And the session this morning and also this afternoon will be streamed online. We're going to be moving around a little bit today as well. We've got a number of workshops. These workshops are a fantastic opportunity for you to further engage in the research. Yesterday should hopefully have really given you a taste of what the NHRA program of research now really looks like. And now is the opportunity through the workshops to further engage, influence, but be thinking about impact. How is this research useful to you? How can it make an impact in your organisation? And if it's not going to, tell us, because we want to make sure it does, and we want that feedback about how we can make sure that our research is being as impactful as possible, because that's our key mission, to be investing in research which is going to have that key impact. But yeah, we are going to be moving around. I'll give you a few details at the conclusion of this session, but we'll be, as well as in here, we'll be down at level 1. We'll also be on level 7 for those workshops. But please be careful moving around. The stairs are probably the best way to move around, but be careful going up and down the stairs. But you can obviously use the lift there as well. For those that have just come today, there's a couple of new registrations. The bathrooms are just between levels, just up these stairs on the left-hand side there as well. A reminder about questions, engage with Slido. That's the best way. Or if we do have questions on the main floor, we'll also have the roving mic, but Slido is the best way there. And social media. So remember, there's a few tweeters in the room, which is great. So continue to keep the conversation going there online as well. So just to touch on a few other aspects here as well. We now want to really get into the launch of this really important piece of social research which the Centre has commissioned in the aftermath of the floods in New South Wales and Queensland March to June last year. The Centre is actually actively working also now in Tasmania to extend this work, and also just finalising a project here in Victoria around the social impacts of the floods that were experienced in Victoria in October and November last year also. It's so vitally important, this work. It's so important, and that's why we have this program of post-disaster research and natural hazard research Australia. So we are able to collect those experiences of community members in the case of this particular project, which are vital to informing our policy into the future, our plans, and the way that we engage with communities, particularly before, during, and after events. And Dr Mel Taylor will come shortly to provide an overview of the research, but there's so much really to unpack in this piece of research effort, and we'll be really working very closely with our participant end users to ensure that they get the benefit out of this research. The work has really demonstrated that strong end user commitment, but that partnership as well. So been working really closely with organisations, particularly QFES and New South Wales SES, in how we've been able to shape this piece of work, but also making sure that it's having that difference. Also, when talking about this research, we've got to acknowledge that we're researching something which was incredibly traumatic for those that were impacted, and for anybody online or here today that was impacted by the floods in any way, our thoughts are certainly still with you in terms of your ongoing recovery, and certainly acknowledge the impacts of the events. We have invited senior representatives from New South Wales and QFES as key end users and partners to speak about the report before I ask Mel to come up and give her detailed presentation. One really tragic thing, many of you have obviously heard overnight in the media, and unfortunately Mike Wassing, who was due to come and address us all, is unfortunately able to be with us and passes on his apologies. The tragic passing of first-class firefighter Isabella Nash after an accident at a fire scene yesterday. And our thoughts and prayers certainly go out to her family, and also the family and colleagues of her, and also her injured colleagues as well. I think, my own personal reflection is that this is just a reminder of the incredible risks our first responding agencies take on a day-to-day basis, and it's tragic that this has happened. We have to acknowledge it, but we also have to acknowledge all our first responders who do take those risks on our behalf on a daily basis, and how incredibly thankful we should be for them for doing that. We also share our thoughts and prayers with the broader QFES family and the direct colleagues of those firefighters. We are incredibly privileged, though, to have Deputy Commissioner of the New South Wales SES, Daniel Austin, with us right now. So I'll invite Daniel up to the stage, and then I've got a short statement here also on behalf of Greg Leach that I'll read out, and then we'll get Mel up to tell us all about the report.
Thank you, Andrew. Good morning, everybody online as well as those in the building. Can I start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the owners of the lands upon which we meet this morning. Can I also extend our sympathies to our friends and colleagues in QFES. It is news that none of us ever want to hear about the passing of a colleague. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm really privileged to be here. This is a fantastic piece of work around community survey following the floods of early 2022. It is absolutely vital that we actually engage with communities to understand their learnings as well. There's been many sayings across emergency services about making sure that we don't just do things to the community, but we do things with the community. And this is absolutely a piece that will guide that into the future. The last 3 years has been an amazingly, incredibly busy operational period, but that means it's incredibly busy and incredibly traumatic for the community as well. And clearly, when you get to read the research, that comes through time and time again. And whilst SES members by default are members of their own communities, and we can draw on their experiences, it is absolutely vital that we do go beyond that and we actually learn across the board. I'd like to thank Mel and the team for undertaking this work. But even before we get to that, this actually highlights a very strong relationship between the New South Wales SES and NHRA, and the fact that even long before the flooding started, we were having conversations with our node manager, Kat Haynes, around what we may or may not do when things impacted and how we could learn from them. So to all agencies, I absolutely suggest that they get involved with these sorts of programs. This is a major step in the recovery and moving forward for those communities as well as an agency, and we all look forward very much to learning from it. It is a team effort. We've said that time and time again. So thank you all very much. And Mel and the team, thank you for the work you've done. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and thank you very much for coming down today to address us as well. So I'll just quickly read also and the end user impact statement from Commissioner Greg Leach of QFES. So he writes, partnering as an end user agency with Natural Hazards Research Australia on this work afforded QFES the opportunity to support and engage in a unique community-focused post-event investigation. Grounded in the rigour of a mixed methods approach used previously by the Bushfire Natural Hazards CRC and aligning strongly with QFES values and guiding principles, the research described in the community experience of the January-July 2022 floods in New South Wales and Queensland Summary Report captured community members' post-event stories, including less quantifiable aspects that can often be missed. A more person-centred community focus permitted more personal input beyond traditional metrics used to describe experiences associated with an event, with analyses leading to a set of policy relevant themes. Accurately gauging, considering and applying community experience and perspective is an important part of contemporary emergency sector agencies and the services they deliver. The current research demonstrates that community members directly impacted by the 2022 rainfall and flood events have valuable insights they are willing to share, together with an optimism that lessons learned from their tragedy can genuinely be contributed to the evolution of prevention, preparedness, response and recovery policy. QFES looks forward to seeing the uptake and application of these important findings and to expanding research partnerships on further community-focused topics. So thank you, Commissioner Greg Leach, for those comments. So I'm about to welcome Dr Mel Taylor up, the lead researcher on this piece of work, but I want to acknowledge the entire effort of the research team. So we've got researchers from the University of Southern Queensland, we've also got researchers from Macquarie University and Queensland University of Technology involved in this project. And I know from the back and forth over the last month, 6 weeks, the incredible amount of work and effort that has gone into this report. So I really want to commend them all for the enormous amount of effort, passion that they've put into this particular work. I said to Mel and the team last night that I really think that effort that they've put in will really demonstrate a hell of a lot of impact, and we're already seeing that. You know, when we've been talking to various stakeholders, seeing early impact. We're speaking to a really large industry body the other day who's just commissioned an external review. They're saying we will use this report. Talking to one of our other end users the other day, they're asking for the report to say we want to use this in our next business case, and this is all within the first week of even before the report is launched, which is fantastic. So with that, I'll welcome Dr Mel Taylor to the floor to provide a presentation on the results.
No pressure. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to everybody in the room, and welcome to everybody online as well. In addition to the people who've already been acknowledged as being online with us, I'd also like to extend a welcome to a few of the SES personnel that we spoke to along the way, and also to some of the participants that I know are online today as well, and we really appreciate all of your time and effort. So thank you so much for that. I also want to just quickly acknowledge the team. You see their names up there. There's quite a number of us. It was a big project, and I also want to thank NHRA node managers, Kat Haynes and Nicola Moore, for their support, and the rest of the team as well. And of course, the end users in QFES and New South Wales SES who've been with us all the way and very supportive. I'm very excited to be able to sort of wave around the very thin summary report, which goes alongside the main report. For those in the room who have a copy, you can have a look at that now. But for those of you who are online, you don't need to wait. It's online now on the website, so you can go and access that there, as well as the main report, which really contains so much of the information. I also wish to make a disclaimer. I am an academic, not a diplomat, so I hope I haven't offended too many people with some of the suggestions for policy approaches. Okay, please bear with me on this one. A few days ago I was thinking, how am I going to do this? How am I going to do this in half an hour and do justice both to the people who've given us their time and their thoughts, and also, of course, the research and the research team? And then my thoughts turned to chocolate, as they often do. And I thought, this is a good analogy. I'm going to use this one. So what I want to do today is I want to tell you about the contents. I want to tell you what we've got inside the box. I'm hoping that I can convince you of the quality, and I hope that you will want to have more of a taste of this once you've got an idea of what there is there. I also want to say that we have really rich data. We have a lot of qualitative data. That takes time to digest. And also, you don't have to eat the whole box in one sitting. So please, I do implore you to take a look and to choose the things you're interested in, but then also go and take a look at some of those other areas too. So here's a picture of one of our team, Maddie, down by the river, one of the rivers near Woodburn, having a conversation with one of our participants. As you've already heard, the mixed method approach we've used is a combination of qualitative interview research and also survey-based quantitative research. We're using methodology that's been tried and tested, mostly in bushfires, but is very much trauma-informed. So the approach we take with this sort of research is we talk to the participants and we just say, please tell us about your experiences of the flood. And the idea is that they can lead us, they can tell us the things that are important and salient to them. And then at the end, we can bring up some of the areas they may not have covered that we wanted to make sure that were included in that research. And of course, the issue that I have here standing now is that the depth and the quality of that research is really hard to give in a soundbite. So I will try and give you a few quotes. There are more in the main report, but hopefully you've got the message now that there's more here to look at. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the two methods we use, so the qualitative and the quantitative research. So with the interviews, we conducted 192 interviews in total, which is a lot of work. Most of those were averaging around 45 minutes or so. We did 92 in Queensland and 100 in New South Wales, and our team, as you already know, is based on a group of New South Wales-based researchers and Queensland researchers, and so we took the different states and did a combination of virtual video interviews and also field work on the ground. So our New South Wales team, we went to the Northern Rivers a couple of times and spoke to people directly on the ground there, and our Queensland team went around and looked and spoke to people at Gympie, Maryborough, and in some of the suburbs to the west and around Brisbane area. And you can see on the map there, that's a postcode map, you can see some of the places that our interviewees came from. It's hard on this sort of screen to see the detail around the suburbs in Sydney and Brisbane, but we do have a lot of interviews from around the Brisbane suburbs here as well. Another really important piece of information to convey now is that we conducted these interviews from mid-August through to the end of October in a 10-week period. And the reason that's important is because I've told you already about the nature of the interviews and how we speak to ask people to tell us about their experiences, and they talk about the salient things that that have affected them. And of course, at this point in time, for those people that were impacted at the end of February, early March, they were now between 6 and 8 months into the post-flood experience, so they had already contributed in some cases to the independent review that had been undertaken and had been published at this point. And of course in Queensland as well, community was included in a lot of that work as well. But I think that some of the advantage we had with going in at this point in time was that people had had an opportunity to think about what had happened, to think about what they were going to do in the future, and many, of course, were already on their journey of trying to go through reconstruction and recovery as communities and individually. The other important point here, and in the data you have, is, as you would anticipate, if you're aware of the flooding that's occurred in these locations, we have people that have experienced a whole heap of different experiences, everything from the sorts of things you see on the media, the life-threatening flash floods experiences that were in the Lismore area and elsewhere, through to more extreme floods than usual. So we have everybody here who has experienced everything from waking up with water literally lapping at their feet or their hands, through to those people who managed very well but actually still experienced quite an extreme flood. So there's a whole lot of experiences in here. There's not one single view of this. And other people perhaps didn't get so directly impacted in their homes, but their lives were largely impacted. So people that were experiencing landslides, isolation, who are still 5 months down the track, had sort of detours of 1.5 hours to get to the local supermarket that would have been 20 minutes if the other road was available. So you can appreciate some of those things. And on the right-hand side there, you can see the sorts of things we asked about in the interviews. So we really did cover everything from what happened before, the prior exposure people had had to flooding, and I'm from the northwest of Sydney, so people in the Hawkesbury area at this point in time, and in July when we spoke to a lot of people who'd been flooded again with the worst floods in the series. Some of them had been impacted 5 times in that period, in that 15-month period. In the survey, you can see similar areas are covered. We have 430 people that took part in our online survey, and it was very involved. And so you can see on the right-hand side there, at least at some level, some detail there. But what I wanted to convey here is that there's a lot of information from the survey here, and it took about 30 to 40 minutes at least for most people to complete this. In terms of the analysis on the survey, in the report, the main report, you'll find that we've done some comparisons in the data, some simple statistics, looking at differences between states, looking at differences in degree of preparedness of people, whether they'd experienced prior flooding, whether they had damage in the 2022 floods in their homes, age and gender, and insurance, whether they had insurance, flood insurance or not. So we've done that analysis, and that's in the main report. Now, I guess I'm at that chocolate box moment where you sort of got the key. So this is what there is in the main report. So we've got 5 cross-cutting themes that were identified that really have impacted across the board and have made these floods in the first half of 2022 particularly challenging for individuals and families, but also for the emergency services as well. And I'm going to mention those 5 cross-cutting themes. We've got themes that came from the qualitative data, from the interviews that were driven by the salient points that people wanted to make, the things that the team felt had been particularly significant for people. So they're in the report, and I will gloss over those because there's too many to go through in detail, but I will outline those. We've also got 5 areas from the survey which were particularly important for our end users to look at, so we're keen for that information to be there from the survey. And then I'll talk about 4 challenge areas, and I'm not going to mention those today in any detail, but this includes things like a gradual erosion of trust and some issues there, issues about integrating the community more broadly into the whole emergency service or emergency response and recovery management. Looking at the emotional toll and the emotional impacts, and also then seeing this as being bigger than just disaster, that we need to be having a much more person-centred approach when it comes to looking at individuals outside of the disaster context. If we can strengthen them in the peacetime, then hopefully they can be more resilient when we come to the adversities that they've had to face in this and in other areas too. So onto some of the content here. So these are 5 of the cross-cutting themes that were mentioned, and I don't think there'll be any huge surprises here. And in fact, a lot of the time we are finding things that are very consistent with the findings of others, and Brendan Moon brought up a lot of the points that certainly we concur with in our research as well. So the first 3 there, I'm going to briefly mention those. Obviously, we had the severity of the floods. We've had the word unprecedented. That was very much a case in our interviews as well. We have the scale, as in the magnitude and the impact across a broad area. And of course, that has had impacts on scarcity of trades, of individuals. We've got supply issues, a whole heap of administration burden that is excessive and exceptional as part of all of this. And of course that's blown out timelines, and for individuals that timeline component had a massive impact on them in terms of recovery, of getting back, of thinking about some of the decisions they made. Another thing we have here on the screen, on the graph there, is the impact. Again, the point I'm making here is we asked people about whether they'd experienced prior flooding. And so on the left-hand side there, you've got the blue bars from New South Wales, red from Queensland, and the green are the total sample. On the left-hand side there, we've got more than a third of the sample who have not had previous flooding in their homes, which might not sound surprising if it was a general population survey, but it really goes to show that there were a lot of people who'd not been impacted previously by flooding, and some of those people had been in their homes for 20 or 30 years, so they really had no idea that they were even prone to flooding. So they mostly were really unprepared for floods. We then had people who'd been flooded in the 2021, so the prior year, so perhaps haven't even had an opportunity to get their heads around recovery or getting back on their feet. We've got people who were flooded in that sort of 2015-2020 period and before 2015, and some of those across multiple periods. So we've got a really, I guess, flood experience and a flood naive group in there too that we can look at. And that comment at the bottom there was quite typical of those people who hadn't been flooded before, saying that they had gone, they'd bought their house, they'd looked at insurance, and they'd been told, it just doesn't flood here, you don't need flood insurance. So even some of those people that could have afforded flood insurance, and of course that's an issue for those people who have had previous flooding, a lot of them didn't have flood insurance either because they didn't think they'd ever be impacted. Another impact that has had, another area that's had an impact across the data we collected is this idea of compounding and concurrent disasters. We've heard about it a lot here, and the impacts of climate change. And I guess in this context, we've got that prior flooding. Some of the people we spoke to had been threatened by bushfires previously, and some had been impacted by bushfires in previous places they'd lived. So they had already experienced a number of setbacks, if you like, along the way. But of course, there was an overlay of COVID in this as well. So we found that COVID had had impacts in terms of community. So there'd been a reduction in the amount of times and contact that people had had with each other. This had had impacts also for the emergency services, the volunteers in the community who hadn't had the same opportunities to get together, to practice together, and to bond in that context. We had issues in the way in which people were managed in evacuation centres to do with COVID, again, because of the concerns around potential for infection and things like that. And at the point we did a lot of the interviews, there was also a third La Nina that was being forecast, so people had that sort of spectre in their heads as well. So there was quite a lot going on still that was of a concern for them. And that comment there, I'm just going to quickly read it because I'm not sure how well you can see it, especially if you're online. But it says, between COVID and this, I don't think you can separate the two because we're already so far behind the 8 ball when this happened to us. We literally went from, we're going to get freedom to, well, we actually stepped even further back than COVID because being isolated and stuck at home was one thing, and not going to town or whatever, and the uncertainty, and then adding this other whammy on, where you just can't see what your future is even going to hold for you. So, moving on from this, I also wanted to mention the vulnerability context, and we've heard this as researchers in the room, you'll know this too, that if there are already existing vulnerabilities in communities, if you add adversity, whether it's floods, bushfires, or other events, it's going to exacerbate those underlying vulnerabilities. So everything from that physical, location-related vulnerability here through the social and economic vulnerabilities. And that was certainly evident as we went around in the fieldwork looking at different communities. You could see some were completely taken out by the floods and probably were already struggling, to be honest, before that, in terms of housing quality, of the demographics, potential crime rates and things like that. So in some of those communities that already had existing issues, things like looting and things were going on as well. Another thing that was interesting in terms of vulnerability was some of the created vulnerabilities. And so when we were in the Northern Rivers, you're possibly aware that there were plans there to have caravans available for people to live in the short term whilst their homes were being repaired and they could move back in. And I want to say that the people we spoke to were extremely grateful for that. They were very happy that they had somewhere to live and it was safe and it was on site. So there were lots of advantages, so I don't want to lose that in this quote. But what we also found was a lot of people in these areas were living in two-storey houses. So before the floods, they were raised up above the ground. So I'm going to read this one again. It says, at the moment, this town is full of people in these caravans. Nearly every house or even second house has a rented caravan on it at ground level. So if there's another flood, even a small flood, all of those caravans are going to flood. I don't know what the answer is. I don't know what we're going to do. I don't know if it's going to be an ongoing issue, if it's just a particular La Nina issue. Is it climate change? Is it what? I don't know, but for me personally, there's no guarantee that it's not going to happen again. Therefore, it's not worth me spending my limited resources fixing something that even then becomes vulnerable, because I don't have the money to fix it a second time. And this was a recurring theme. You know, people that had been flooded definitely felt that they would like to be flooded again. They were having to spend what resources they had to live and to make their house livable again. In some cases, they didn't have the opportunities to improve them or to make adaptations that might make them more resilient in the future. And you can imagine some of the, the stresses that are involved with all of that. Another comment about the cross-cutting themes in the vulnerability context, the last one here. And I've used this particular piece of data from the report about how people first found out about the floods and how they were going to be impacted in their area. And people were only allowed to give one answer to this, and as you can see already that most people, or a larger proportion of the sample, had observed this for themselves. They'd identified that information. I think if you just then can sort of ignore that piece and look at the other data in here, what you may be able to see, depending on how good your screen is that around 10% of people were told by friends, family and neighbours. And that was quite an important piece of information there in terms of, there were official sources, people found the information out, but there were also people that heard from friends and neighbours. And of course that's fine if you've got friends and neighbours, and fine if your friends and neighbours do contact you. So we found that 12% of people found other here. And if you look at other, a lot of the time it was saying that they didn't hear, they didn't know, they weren't aware, no one had contacted them, no neighbours had knocked on the door, and they were completely unaware of the fact that flooding was going to occur. And I think, again, that just, some of that is to do with the vulnerability, the lack of connectivity and the lack of that engagement with neighbours. Moving on to the themes that came from the interviews that are in the report. These are the 13 themes that we chose to select. They're only a subset of a number that we could have used. And these were things, as I said, that were fairly salient to residents. We heard them in a number of places, so they are things that multiple people have said to us. But of course, there are other things that were said by one or two people that are also equally important when it comes to considering those in a qualitative context. The ones in green, and again, this is my little pitch for the workshop after this, after the presentations in this room, there's the workshops, and for those who want a bit more of a taste of some of these themes, if you stay here, we'll be talking about those ones in green and pulling them apart and giving you a much more of an opportunity to hear about them and to think about them with us. I'll try and pick up a few pieces of data as I go through for these other ones. In terms of the areas in the survey, I've picked up here, these are things we went through in detail from the survey, including things about the preparedness of individuals, the actions they took, the numbers of actions people took. We've got information about the warnings, about their trust in various sources of information. We've got information about sheltering and rescue that I'm hoping that I can have some time at the very end of this to go back to. We also asked a lot about housing and reconstruction and making homes more resilient and the actions that people had taken beforehand or were planning and were planning to do afterwards. And also looking at the sources of support and their own self-rated recovery, which again has been really interesting as part of this research. So I've got 10 findings from the report that I've condensed here. That, depending on how you want to frame them, you could see them as needs, needs of the community, or you can see them as challenges for various different organisations working in this context. And I wanted to give this one its own slide because it was the one thing that came out that won't be a surprise, I'm sure, to many of you in the room, and that is the importance of community and the importance of connectedness. Where it was lacking, people were struggling. Where it was there, it was evident and it was heartening. And there were a number of places where people would get emotional when you would speak to them. One of them was obviously talking about what had happened to them. The other was when they were talking about the generosity and the helpfulness of others. And so accepting that help has been quite a major thing for many people, but it was definitely there in communities, and it was so important to have that support. It was community, it was neighbours, it was friends, it was family who were telling people about alerting them to the flood. They were the ones who were the most trusted people in the, in that sort of hierarchy in terms of information. They provided help during the floods. They were having conversations, making decisions together collectively. They were the ones who were helping in the clear up and the clean up and taking things and repairing them for people and giving them back. And they were the most appreciated in terms of the support. So the one main thing I would like to mention here is that if we do nothing else, if we can just help to build communities, build connectedness, build connection, I think in whatever context that is going to help across the board, whether that's in disasters, whether it's other sorts of adversities, or whether it's just quality of life. So please, that's my one plea. Moving on. Okay, my 10-minute, thank you. Two other things here. So communication, again, no surprises. Communication was important across the board, not just in the information and warnings, but of course that was important, and of course that has been looked at, and of course we've spoken to people about that. But also in other areas, it's important for our organisations to be communicating with communities about what actions they're taking, what they know, what they want people to do, also communicating about the consequences of some of the decisions that people are having to make. So in the reconstruction, there was that sort of helplessness and sort of limbo, because people didn't know that if I accept a payback for something, what will happen then if I sell my home or I take something else on a buyback? And those sorts of things were quite paralysing. So I think just having a bit more information about the consequences and the consequences when it came to claiming on insurance and what evidence you needed, those sorts of things. So communication across the board, really, really important. Another key thing was the idea of having a presence. People who had been checked in on, albeit just somebody walking up the road and saying, are you okay? If that happened from someone in an official capacity or someone with a uniform or someone from local council, there was so much appreciation for the fact that they hadn't been forgotten. It was a small thing. They didn't necessarily need to even do things or offer things, but that was there. People were really, really very, very grateful for that support they got from the emergency services, from the fireys, helping to clean out homes and things like that. So that was, again, being on the ground early and having a presence was felt to be really important. I just want to draw attention to the graph there. So we asked people about their preferred methods for communication in future floods. And this comes down to some of that communication kind of context, I guess. But you can see there the SMS was the one thing that people were most keen to have in terms of alerting in the future. And I suppose, it speaks back a bit to the vulnerability. So we found in the data that those people that were over the age of 65 were less likely to have received SMS texts than those who were younger. We found that those people who were over 65 were more likely to be listening to the radio compared to the other age groups. So we know there are issues there in terms of differences in demographics, but we also know there are differences there in terms of things like the poor mobile reception and loss of services. So a quarter of our survey participants were already in pre-existing areas where there was poor reception to start with. Nearly half of them lost mobile communication at the time of the floods, and about half had electricity outages. So there were a whole lot of issues there that also need to be considered, and if we're going to look more at those sort of technology enabled, we need to make sure that we're going to keep that service alive. Some more findings. That's the idea of having greater integration and inclusion of communities. Again, probably no surprises here. We know that communities respond. We know they'll respond whatever the rules say or whatever people want them to do. So there is a need, and an ongoing need, for us to find out better ways to incorporate the community into the planning, into preparedness, to help with training, and these things have been picked up in inquiries and they came out in our research as well. There's also a need for a bit more flexibility. So one thing I'm picking out here was an example from the research area, but there were other areas too where the rules were so hard or harder on people who'd been impacted. So the need for documentation after the floods to prove who you were, to claim things, there were some struggles there for people, where people who had not been so impacted had much easier access to those things. So, there was a sense of more of a burden, I guess, from that point of view. But also some people just wanted to get back in their homes. They wanted to be on site so they could, oversee the work, they could be more settled, they could, have their ties with their community. And their homes perhaps weren't as badly damaged as others. And they were finding occasionally there were problems with the rules in terms of, repairing. So you've got somebody here saying that the insurer was on our back. They didn't want to pay us the accommodation, as in, temporary accommodation. But on the other side of the coin, we kept saying to them, if we just can get some initial work done to the house that will allow us to do that initial work, we can get back in quickly. All we wanted was a new hot water service. We wanted some electrical work done. And so, as you will have seen in the media, I'm sure as well, there were people living in homes that had maybe 1 or 2 rooms repaired. It wasn't comfortable living, but they were on site, they were in their community, they were able to sort of get on with their lives in a more normal way, albeit sort of less comfortably. Another thing that came up a number of times was this idea about agency or loss of agency, as in personal ability to control what was happening. So, that sort of sense of helplessness of being at the whim of the rules of external forces, that was really tricky for people. I won't read out the second quote here, but it was one thing that came up about the temporary accommodation, because as we know, we have an accommodation crisis. A lot of people had moved away from cities, so there was already sort of more burden on those regional areas. And those people in temporary accommodation, often in holiday accommodation, were being asked to sort of move out of their rooms at 10 o'clock and had nowhere to go until 2. So, if you've got your whole life in your car or your room or your cars, this person in particular was saying they had to take the day off, their daughter had to take the day off so they could just move their things from one place to another. And they had that homelessness situation for that intervening period, which was really hard for them to deal with. Not surprisingly, I think a number of issues were here, because of the scale, because of a whole lot of other issues around resourcing, whether that was people, whether that was financial. I'm picking out on the local councils here because they were at the tough end of all of this, very much, there with the community. And in the period we were doing the data collection, they'd had a lot of time to reflect on what sort of might have contributed to their flooding or the worst flooding that they'd experienced. And we found that infrastructure issues were coming up across the board, in particular things like stormwater drainage, the maintenance of drainage, things like dredging in rivers, those sorts of things that people felt had contributed to the flooding they experienced. And then the last point here was about looking at removing the burden from flood-impacted people. I've sort of mentioned some of that in terms of the documentation, the need to project manage the work that was going on. Again, in some situations that went well, but others people were struggling generally, and to have to sort of deal with all of these other things, the burden was being put back on them, and they were sort of finding it tough. I left the last 2 points here, the tricky ones, I think, in many ways, to the end. So we asked people at the end of the interviews, what is it that they wish that what did they learn about themselves, or they felt other people should know about, that they felt would help them if they found themselves in a situation? And very often, we had some fabulous responses here, but one of them was improved preparedness. I wish we was more prepared. I wish I'd done more. I wish I could have protected myself more. And so we're really sort of making an appeal here to use the information, to use the stories, to work with that information in engagement to try and find new ways to engage and to use the experiences that have just been experienced here to help people to revise what they might do in future. But I do say that with a bit of a caveat, because at the end of the day I'm a psychologist and I know about heuristics and people's decision making, and I thought this was an interesting graph, because this graph here shows you in blue the people who had no prior flooding at their property, and in red those people who had prior flooding at their property before 2022. And we asked them about the perceived likelihood that their property would be impacted by flooding. And of course, it's not surprising that in the blue there, you can see a lot of people thought it was very unlikely. If they hadn't had flooding before, they thought it was very unlikely their property would have been flooded. Fair enough. And you can see that the red bars move slightly to the right there, and you'd expect that. So people have had flooding, say, yeah, it's probably more likely that my place will get flooded again. But if you add up those bars on the left-hand side in red, you'll find about over a third of people are saying, oh no, I think it's really extremely unlikely that I'll get flooded again. So people are very quick to kind of discount risk to future risk. So I think we need to bear that in mind as well here. And then that final point is, I guess, another real big one. It doesn't matter how much protective action you take, what good decisions you make. If the floodwater comes up and it keeps coming, you've got nowhere to put your belongings. There's nothing you could have done to have saved yourself. So what we really need to be looking at are those transformative adaptations. We need to look at improving the housing, raising the houses, moving off the floodplains, building better, addressing issues of climate change. And we need some courage there to be able to do that. I know I'm nearly at time, or if I'm not at time, I just want to talk very briefly, if I may. Okay. Oh, sorry, do you want me on? I'm good. Okay, thank you. Sorry. I wanted to mention before I left what people did during the flood, because I thought this would be the sort of information that everyone would have some interest in. And of course, there's lots of policy implications in this research too. And so we asked people what they did. Were they not at home? If they were at home, did they leave under their own steam? Or did they stay and maybe stay throughout, or stay and perhaps need rescue or help with relocation afterwards? And of course, we have people of a whole lot of different experiences here who came alongside with this. We found that just short of 10% weren't at home, so we parked that group in some way. We found that just under 30% left their home, either before the flooding or during the floods, and 61% stayed. So a large proportion of our sample stayed during the floods and sheltered in place. Just like bushfires, although those people who left under their own steam got out of harm's way eventually, just like leaving late in a bushfire, there were a lot of very dramatic moments in there. So the act of staying and sheltering, although there's a risk to that, there was also a risk in people leaving late. So there are stories of people who were, walking through increasingly deep floodwater with people who couldn't swim, people with children with their floaties on, and a spouse that was a strong swimmer trying to get away from their property because they thought it was going to get worse, and worse things were going to happen. So there were experiences like that in our data. In terms of the people who stayed in their properties, you were more likely to stay if you were over 65 years of age. You were also more likely to stay if you'd previously been flooded. You were more likely to stay if you had more than 24 hours to take some kind of action beforehand. And I think that's a proxy for the kind of the rate at which the water was coming up, perhaps some of the severity of the flooding. You were more likely to leave if you'd had damage to your home in 2022, which again is a proxy for the kind of the damage that was done. And if your home was badly damaged. So I think, again, we can see some of those people here who were staying. And of those who did stay, 20% needed some form of rescue, whether that was a sort of emergency kind of rescue, or whether that was relocation later when the floodwaters weren't going down, that people had to be evacuated out. If you look at the graph there, you can see some of the reasons. Hopefully you can read some of that, but you can see some of the reasons why people stayed. And I think this is really interesting as well, because you can see that just over half left because stayed because they were unable to leave. They were either trapped or they were isolated in their homes because of the rising floodwater. 44% said that it was always their plan to stay. And I think it's really important to know that these aren't mutually exclusive. So it's possible that people plan to stay, but actually also they couldn't have left even if they'd wanted to. So there's some overlap here, so don't be misled by that. It's also interesting to look further into this data here, because you can see there are already some vulnerabilities turning up here. So there are people who stayed because they felt it was too late to leave or unsafe to leave. There are people in there down the bottom who had nowhere to go. 14% said they had nowhere to go, and that's one of the reasons they stayed. 6% said they had no transport, and the reason they stayed. Others, because they had physical difficulties, and they or another house member was unable to leave. So there are a whole heap of sort of vulnerability issues there as well. And of course, other people didn't have as bad flooding, so some people felt they didn't need to leave anyway. So that was also interesting. So in terms of the impacts of staying, we found that those people who did stay encountered a number of different challenges as well. So 75% lost electricity, 52% lost communications, 38% lost sewerage and working toilets, and 32% felt very anxious about about not being able to leave. So a whole heap of anxiety on top of all of this as well. We had 12% of people who had some sort of injury or illness, 10% ran out of medication, and 15% ran out of food. So, that's all in there too. However, intriguingly, and you've got to love people, when we asked them about whether their decision to stay was the right decision or not, 79% said yes, it was the right decision. And there were a whole heap of reasons for that. Some of them were because people wanted to continue to protect their property. They wanted to prevent looting. They wanted to look after animals. There were a whole lot of reasons, but I think it's really interesting that even though people went through quite a lot of adversity, some needed rescue, that there was still a lot of people saying we did the right thing, and I know that has been found in other research as well. So this is a goodbye from myself and the team. There's a photograph of the team here. We've got Fiona and Anne are also in the room here. I hope that some of the team are online, and thank you so much for all your efforts too. If you're interested in looking more at the data, you can contact the node managers here at NHRA, and if you're interested in the report, you can go to the website and download it there. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mel, and also that acknowledgement to the broader team. So Fiona Miller, who's here at the front too, Kim Johnson, Anna Lane, Barbara Ryan, Rachel King, Harriet Narwhal, Madeline Miller, Deepika Dabas, and Helga Simon as well. What a great team effort. And the results. Somebody was talking to me this morning about the program yesterday, that they could see what we were going to be doing in the future, that the work that was already started up and running, and then we started talking about findings. You're starting to see that we're already starting to deliver some findings there as well, and some results which are great that you can start to use and have impact. Now, this next presentation, which is going to be with Dr. Briony Rogers and Neil Munro, really focused on a project that we've been funding for a little bit in terms of called the work's really about to proactively working with schools and school-age education. So I'm going to call them up now. We're really focused on research utilisation here, how we can be making a difference through research. So Briony and Neil, if you'd like to come up, please. And I think we've got one other. We've got Alan Slipovich as well. So welcome, Alan.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Andrew. Just a brief introduction, because this project is really close to my heart. We all know when we're engaging with knowledgeable communities how much easier it is to work with them. And well, better to start with educating kids that then educate their parents, or when they become adults, they are much easier to engage with us. And if we want to make any difference into the future with all the changes that are coming our way, we have to get it through the social license, and we need the knowledgeable communities to undertake that work. So without further ado, this was absolutely brilliant, the project, and I was privileged to see a presentation by kids in the school, and I was really blown away to how they applied the knowledge they received from the research team and other people helping with it. So I will leave you in the capable hands of Dr. Briony and Captain Neil, as the kids call them. So.
Thank you, Alan. Do we get slides here? Oh, they're here. Okay, great. And just going to get set up here. Okay, thank you. I'm Briony Towers. I acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the sovereign owners of the land on which we gather here today, and I acknowledge and I pay my respects to elders past and present. So the research utilisation project that Neil and I will be talking about this morning has emerged from the Bushfire and Natural Hazard CRC project on building best practice in child-centred disaster risk reduction, which ran from 2015 to 2020. As you can see, we had a lot of end users on that project, most of the fire agencies, at least those across southeastern and Western Australia. And we had a really fantastic research team, a multidisciplinary research team. I realised on my way in this morning that two very important people have been cut off the bottom of that slide, and that is Tony Jarrett, who actually joined us as an end user on the project when he was at the New South Wales RFS, and then re-identified as a PhD student. And also Belinda Davis, who came on to the project to help me in the final stages after our dear Kevin Ronan became very unwell and had to move on from the project. So, a major focus of that project was school-based bushfire education. In 2015, after 80 years of recommendations from bushfire royal commissions and formal inquiries, bushfire had finally been included in the national curriculum, and helping schools had become a major priority for the fire agency end users on our project. But there was very little to inform the approach that fire agencies were taking to supporting schools to implement that curriculum. So we embarked on a series of consultations, program evaluations, and action research projects in school communities around the country, from the Perth Hills to the Wheat Belt to the Dandenong Ranges to the Hunter Valley, and it was a wild ride. We're so grateful to every school principal, teacher, school administrator, student, parent and brigade volunteer who has helped us to get a better understanding of what quality school-based bushfire education looks like. So, what does quality bushfire education look like in schools? My analysis of the CRC project data suggests that there are 5 good practice principles that are fundamental to achieving positive outcomes for students and their communities. The first principle is transdisciplinary curriculum design. In the Australian curriculum, bushfire-related content is located in the discipline-based learning area of geography. But if students are to develop the knowledge, skills and dispositions that will equip them to live safely in a bushfire-prone environment, we need to adopt a transdisciplinary cross-curricular approach. This approach dissolves the boundaries between the conventional disciplines and organises teaching and learning around real-world problems and themes. In the context of bushfire education, this means integrating content from across the curriculum to include the sciences, the humanities and the arts, which provides students with a deeper, more holistic understanding of the environmental, social, cultural and political dimensions of bushfire. The second principle is place-based pedagogy. Historically, bushfire education programs have tended to rely on standardised content and activities that decontextualise children's learning from the environmental, social and historical contexts of the places in which they live. In place-based pedagogy, the local socio-environmental context becomes the learning ecology. Textbooks and generic worksheets are replaced with local landscapes and experiential activities in the field, and generic information is supplemented with local knowledge, data and predictions. While transdisciplinary curriculum design provides a robust framework for learning about bushfire as a socio-environmental phenomenon, place-based pedagogy makes that learning relevant and meaningful in the context of children's own lives. The third principle relates to action-oriented goals, which position students not as human becomings who can contribute to bushfire risk management one day in the future, but as human beings who can be making valuable contributions today. Action-oriented learning goals create opportunities for students to plan, implement and evaluate their own activities and initiatives in response to authentic challenges in their communities, which means that they are not merely learning about bushfire, they are learning to take informed action both individually and collectively to shape their world. Crucially, action-oriented bushfire education is beneficial for student wellbeing. When students become aware of the potential for bushfire to cause damage and loss in their own communities, they can experience fear and anxiety. But when they are supported to actively address problems and issues that concern them, they develop a sense of safety and security. The fourth principle is student voice, agency and leadership. A key finding from our research is that top-down transmission models of bushfire education that position students as passive recipients of information are not just ineffective, they can leave students feeling confused, disempowered, and worried about the future. But when students are granted some real power in decision-making about what they learn, how they learn it, and what they do with that learning, they have greater motivation to learn and are much more likely to engage in purposeful action. When students are afforded voice and agency in their own learning and action, they build their confidence and competence for identifying problems, finding solutions, and taking informed action to effect change. Highly valuable skills that they can use to manage risk throughout their lives. The fifth and final principle is collaboration and partnership. For a long time, the burden of responsibility for the development of school-based bushfire education programs has been shouldered by the state and territory fire agencies. But transdisciplinary, place-based, action-oriented bushfire education that promotes student voice and agency requires cross-sectoral collaboration and partnership between the fire management and education sectors from the state to the local level. The involvement of the education sector is critical to ensuring that programs are informed by best practice approaches to curriculum integration, teaching and learning, and student assessment. Meanwhile, the involvement of the fire management sector is critical to ensuring that programs reflect current knowledge, strategies, and practices in the real world of fire management. Through collaboration and partnership, the fire management and education sectors can design and implement programs that meet their shared goals and provide students with authentic and meaningful learning experiences. In early 2020, Lauriana Bethune, who was then the Research Utilisation Manager at the BNHCRC, and I started a conversation with the CFA about how we might go about putting these 5 research-informed principles into practice. And 3 years later, and one global pandemic later, here we are. I'm going to hand over to Neil, who is going to tell you about our research utilisation project and what we've achieved to date. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you, Briony. Captain Neil here. It's an honorary title. So, translating research into practice. This wouldn't have been possible without the backing of our sponsors. So, Natural Hazards Research Australia, CFA and DECA, as part of the Safer Together programme, all helped us to realise this dream here. Now, this started off with a fairly simple mission statement, which was to design, develop and test a research-informed approach to bushfire education for upper primary school students, with a focus on scalability and sustainability. And one of the first steps in doing that was to be true to the process and create a multi-agency, multi-sectoral working group, so that we were working with the people, our end users and partners throughout the whole process. So this working group consisted of representatives from the emergency services sector, the education sector, and a variety of specialists, including a CSIRO bushfire scientist, fire ecologist, cultural heritage liaison, Dr. Towers here, and another fantastic talent. And what we embarked on in terms of our development journey was a human-centred design process, where we worked to ensure that students, teachers, schools, and partner agencies all benefited from this approach. Now, as we went through this journey, we identified fairly earlier on that there were 4 key focus areas to work on. So we started with classroom resources, ensuring that there's rigorous, relevant content available for schools and teachers to use. The next was to assess the current capability and capacity of our partner agencies and those in the community to be able to support schools and take a strengths-based approach. There's not always the same capability and capacity in every community, so we needed to take that into account. Then there's the coordination. So we tapped into existing management and structures within agencies, again, trying to make it as easy as possible for partner agencies to coordinate, support, and contribute to this approach. And lastly, strategic enablers. They need to design it to take into account the policy, legislation, and strategy across sectors so that it aligns with priorities in the education sector and emergency services and meets their respective goals. So, onto the classroom resources. There was a three-phase learning model developed, and this was designed in collaboration with our working group, teachers and specialists, and it was developed, tested and refined in the classroom with the teachers and students of Harkaway Primary School. They were absolutely invaluable in giving us that real-life perspective on what worked and what didn't, and obviously Dr. Towers here was a huge influence. Very briefly, Discover is a brief introduction to bushfire for students. Investigate is where students identify a local bushfire problem. And Take Action is where students take action to do something about it, to try to solve the problem. And it's designed to be delivered by teachers inside and outside of the classroom and supported by local knowledge and subject matter expertise. I'm going to take you on a quick whirlwind tour of this. We developed modules to support the Discover phase, and to quickly go through them, the first one is tuning in, and that's where we tune into the existing knowledge, thoughts and feelings of students around bushfire, what their experiences might be, and examine the role that children can play in planning preparedness and response. It really gives the teacher a chance to assess where their class are at and tailor the activities from then on to their class. The next one is fire ecology, where we look at how fire has shaped Victorian ecosystems over millions of years and how plants and animals have developed adaptive traits, and really examining the ecosystems and environments in which students live. The next is Aboriginal cultural burning, so exploring how Aboriginal people have been using fire to care for country for over 60,000 years. You know, how deeply embedded it is in the culture and what we can learn from them. The next is bushfire behaviour in the landscape, and that's where we talk fire science, so how fires start, how they spread, fuel, weather and topography. Again, all of these, just an introduction to these concepts to get students interested and get them thinking about the sorts of things that they can do to help their community. And the last is bushfire risk. So that's examining the potential impacts of bushfire hazards on people, places, and environments. And by this point, students should have a pretty good idea of the kinds of problems they might have in their community and have some motivation to solve them. So the next phase is investigate. This phase is something that schools often do in terms of project-based learning. So we don't like to be prescriptive when it comes to this, but this is an outline of how it could look. So the first thing a student would do is choose a problem to solve. They can form teams to then define that problem that they've identified in their community. They're encouraged to look online to do some online research and to interview local people. And what I mean by that is they can talk to fellow students, they can talk to their teacher, they can talk to their parents, just to make sure that the problem they've identified is a relevant one in their community. And at this point, they might also want to send an email or contact a subject matter expert for more advice through their teacher. And the last phase is take action, and this is where the rubber hits the road in terms of the students really stepping up to the plate. And they'll be ideating solutions, so in other words, brainstorming ideas on how to solve their problems. They'll create some low-fidelity prototypes, which can just be sketches of wireframes for websites, that sort of thing. And at this point, it's a really good idea for them to have a conversation with an expert to make sure they're on the right lines, get some expert advice to help them along the way. From there, they then design their final project, and that's showcased in an open day at the school where you can bring the whole community in potentially. You know, you can have your parents, emergency services, and other community members there, and that learning ecology is really shared amongst the community. Now, in order to help us with that, we've developed supporting resources. So we've pulled together a website with all of the teaching and learning activities. We've developed modules that are aligned with the curriculum for teachers to use, as well as a scope and sequence clearly outlining the curricular alignment. We've developed some instructory videos and also started to pull together some processes to help local experts and agencies to support schools through this journey. Now here's it in practice. Right? We tested it and we developed it at Harkaway, but in January we ran another trial with Chewton Primary School. Now this all started as a conversation, as most engagements with schools do. There was an existing relationship that we were able to work with Chewton Primary School. We introduced the programme to them and they were keen to participate. And I sat down with the classroom teachers to describe the programme, to go through it with them. And from there, it was really all about the school. The school adopted what we developed and tailored it to their local circumstances and to their classroom in front of them. And what happened after that was just fabulous. The school teacher implemented this program in his own way. The students, as they went through their learning journey, created learning journals where they documented what they'd learned throughout the process. And this became a fabulous reminder of the students' creativity. They were able to express their feelings, and they also created poetry, they created artwork, and it became a real whole-of-school effort. Now, this culminated in a student showcase, and the students, over the course of what would have been an 11-week term, if I'm honest, it was more like a 5-week term once we took NAPLAN and swimming into account, they were able to produce projects that were locally relevant, and this ranged from websites to videos, dioramas, bushfire-related games, and they invited the school community in first, so they talked to the younger students initially, and then brought the local community in to showcase and have two-way conversations with emergency services and their parents. And everyone was blown away, including myself. Now, since then, I've had a conversation with the classroom teacher who reflected on this process. And not to blow our own trumpet, but he did describe how it was well designed it was and how easy it was to tailor to his class. It was implemented as an inquiry module, and he described it as being something that was ready-made for him to use. He just had to put his own finishing touches on. He described how it helped to rebuild some of the relationships that the school had with the local emergency services, with parents and other members of the community, and how that had been fractured during COVID. So this was a really good opportunity to bring people back in. It covered lots of curriculum, and it also helped with fear and anxiety in the students as well. So on to the next steps. So the next steps really are all about relationships. We've tested this, we've trialled it as a concept, we've seen that it can work. So we're currently seeking some funding to implement this in other schools and expand this across other areas in Victoria. I've received a lot of expressions of interest from members of emergency services, from municipalities, and from some not-for-profits. They're interested in supporting this and supporting schools. So the next step really is to work with those people, build some capability and capacity, and start building that snowball and rolling it down a hill. So as far as I'm concerned, for a small investment, we can grow this into a sustainable program, makes a positive influence and a positive impact on schools and communities across Victoria. So, if you're interested, pop your questions in Slido, come and have a chat with us at the break, or send us an email. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And do we have some time for questions? No. Stick with Slido and a chat at lunchtime. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Briony. And it's great to see the outcomes of that work being utilised. But it's actually a bit of a track record of Briony's. I remember when I was at SES in Victoria and we were using Briony's PhD to do a little larrikins work. So it's good to see researchers continuing to build upon the outcomes and the impact they're having. So congratulations there too, Briony, for the good work that's being demonstrated there. So we're going to go into the workshop sessions now, and this is the good opportunity to interact with the researchers. I was going to say before there too with particularly the post-flood research. We've got the workshop on that, so that's a good opportunity to ask any questions and interact around that particular topic. We've got the list of workshops up here on the screen now, and so yes, there will be a little bit of moving around the various rooms here. So we've got the lower lecture theatre, so if you want to go to predictions in public, that's in the lower lecture theatre, level 1. There'll be some NHRA staff out there to show you where that room is, but it's down the stairs. We then have in level 7, the enhanced decision making and emergency management. So if you take the stairs up to level 7, you'll find that one there. The community experiences of Queensland is here. So you can stay here, you don't have to go anywhere. So if you don't feel like going up any stairs, you're here. And understanding the resilience of lifelines, you're upstairs as well on level 7. So the workshops will continue there up until morning tea, and morning tea will be back here on level 5. Any questions, ask any of the NHRA staff that are positioned around the various corridors.